Good evening, and thanks very much to everyone for coming, and especially to our friends from the Lincoln Network, the co-sponsors of tonight's event. I'm Reihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, and I'm here with Antonio Garcia Martinez, a fellow with the Lincoln Network, an accomplished entrepreneur, and the best-selling author of Chaos Monkeys, a vivid account of his early years in tech. Over the course of Antonio's long and illustrious career, he co-founded AdGrok, an influential startup he later sold to Twitter, and led Facebook's ad exchange at a time when the young company was still experiencing explosive growth. More recently, he briefly worked for Apple, an experience that I'm hoping he'll tell us a bit about tonight. In addition to his role at the Lincoln Network, Antonio is a prolific writer and thinker who publishes regularly at The Pull Request, his Substack newsletter. The subject of tonight's event is Web3 and the future of big tech. It's no secret that many Americans are deeply concerned about the immense power and influence of today's leading tech platforms. And there's a new generation of tech entrepreneurs, investors, and enthusiasts who believe that the cluster of technologies known as Web3 point the way towards a more competitive and decentralized future for the internet. Antonio has thought deeply about all of this and more, and he's unusually well positioned to help us understand this changing landscape. Thank you, Antonio, for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thank you, Reihan.
This is an event about technology, but I'd like to start with a question about your biography. Here at the Manhattan Institute, we've devoted a lot of attention to cancel culture, and you recently faced what could be called a cancellation attempt over your book, Chaos Monkeys. According to press reports, Apple employees pushed to have you fired over passages from the book that they found objectionable. Can you tell us a bit about the experience?
Well, to the extent I can, given NDAs. But yeah, so I guess the short version is I wrote this best-selling book in 2016 that was a memoir of my time at a very formative time at Facebook. Through the happenstances of history, I ended up being in the right place at the right time when Facebook was figuring out how to actually make money. And so I wrote a very, a very hyperbolic work of literary nonfiction a la early Michael Lewis, Hunter S. Thompson about that experience with all that implied, right? It was a tumultuous time, both in tech and my personal life. And so, there was accounts of my out of wedlock children, living on a boat, what you would sort of imagine, right? Book did well, NPR book of the year, all that stuff. And then fast forward 5 years later, I'm like, well, you know what? I'll just go retire at a FANG company, which is what you do in Silicon Valley. You go retire at a large company and you go work in middle management. And I just changed my LinkedIn profile to, product engineering at Apple on the ads platform, which was interesting because Apple is building a large ads platform. No secret now, I guess. And they're hiring people like me to build it, right? And so it became like a trade press item, but then it became like a woke item. And then there was an internal revolt. I guess the claim to fame, it was the first sort of Slack mob inside Apple, which, as you're probably familiar, be it the New York Times, be it Apple, both coasts, there's these sort of Slack mobs that form because I think people have reached a level of anomie that they express their religious beliefs at work or whatever. That's my personal theory. And so there was a mob calling for my head. Mind you, a mob was 1% of the Apple workforce, just to be clear, right? I think it was less than that, actually. So it was actually a tiny but very vocal set of people. Apple completely and utterly freaked out. And like literally the day that I sold my house up in the Northwest to go move for Apple, they more or less kind of fired me, and like that was the end of it. And then followed a whole media battle and viral tweets, whatever, all that stuff. But yeah, it was a sort of cancellation attempt in although, I think we're onto the Omicron variant of cancellation. Like, I don't think it's actually that big a deal anymore. And like, if you haven't been canceled, are you even trying, really? So, I didn't actually take it that hard at the end of the day. A lot of people ask me like, are you okay? It's like, yes, I'm totally fine. But yeah, no, I think, yeah, it was hard at the time, but I'm not exactly a stranger to being a little bit in the eye of the storm, as I describe in the book. But, yeah.
What is it that led you to ad technology? You were someone with a sterling CV. There was any number of things you could have done. And yet, at the kind of dawn of what, we will later discuss as Web 2.0, this is a world that you jumped into headfirst. So what was it about it?
Well, I'll start. So I'm a failed physicist, basically. I was doing a PhD in physics at Berkeley, had a ponytail, lived in a national house, hung out with the cool Latin American, European crowd, all that crap, right? And one day I just got a haircut and I got a job at Goldman Sachs on the credit trading desk in 2005, which is, of course, the worst time possible to go into that field. But for the next 3 years, I basically saw the entire world, well, sort of peak and then burn down, basically. And I was living in New York, so every time I come back, it reminds me of that period. And I was just like, well, this world is over. Like, we're going to go into recession. This whole joyride is done. And I had vague memories of tech when I was at Berkeley because I had seen the tail end of the first web cycle kind of blow up. And like, I don't know, tech seems totally uncoupled from this disaster. Let's just go there. So I literally bought an old used BMW convertible and just drove into the sunset for 5 days until I got to California. I know it sounds like a ridiculous 70s song, but it's true. And started working in ad tech. People ask like, why is it? Well, it's not that different. You're pricing flitting notions of human attention, right? The credit at the end of the day is the belief that person A will pay person B, and you actually quantify that belief. And that's not that different than quantifying, well, what is the chance that this person's going to engage with this thing at scale? So, it's not as big a leap as you might think. It's if you wanted to apply math to a hard problem to make money in the tech world, it's ad tech. That is like by default what you do, in the same way that in the financial world, it's Wall Street trading.
Do you think the fact that you are a self-described failed physicist
Yeah.
means that you approach this with less of a romantic sense than people who kind of go to Silicon
Yes.
Valley, kind of with utopian ambitions?
I guess it just seems so clean to me. At the end of the day, you make money. You either made money or you didn't on Wall Street, although sometimes it was pretty unclear whether the P&L was up or down. But and the same thing in ad tech. I think it's just, as people know, a lot in tech is kind of bullshitty. While in ad tech, it's very clear. There's a profit and loss at the end of the day, or there's a CTR. So yeah, there's some yearning for objectivity there that I think is driving that at some level. Yeah.
So you have worked for Facebook.
Yeah.
You sold your company to Twitter.
Yeah.
You spent a short stint at Apple.
Yeah.
You have really been in the thick of the biggest, baddest technology companies that have really seized the national imagination, companies that are regularly vilified as well as celebrated. So, some see these companies now as national champions, as really an indication of American innovation at its best. Others literally see them as entities that are poisoning our brains and concentrating wealth, destroying our economy. What do the critics get right and wrong about these companies?
I mean, in general, I think there is no they, right? People often have these theories. Now that I work a little bit in DC, right? They look at tech, or they look at whoever's giving congressional testimony on the Hill, and like, oh, that equals tech. It's like, tech isn't quite that monolithic, right? And to many of us, when we think of tech, we don't necessarily think of, Zuck sitting there sweating under the lights, being drilled by whoever, right? We think of like the spirit of tech, which is like this almost religious faith in disrupting everything all the time, right? So when I think of tech, I think of the entrepreneurs, I think of the VCs, I think less of the big tech companies. It's to me, it's not the same. The other thing I would say is that, like, I often ask, like, look, if you asked a European peasant in 1618 whether the printing press was a good idea, they would probably say no, right? Because they were literally, verged on the 30 Years' War, which is the most violent conflict in Europe until World War I or World War II. And so it's, they hadn't gone to the antibiotics and democracy yet. It's like, it all just sucked, right?
So let's disaggregate a little bit.
Right.
So, people lump together the FANG companies, and apart from the fact that they're all enormous,
right?
They're obviously all very different.
Right.
So kind of talk to us a little bit, differentiate them for us a little bit, in terms of the kind of policy challenges they putatively represent.
Well, I mean, the biggest one obviously is Google and Facebook are ad tech, are ads business models, right? And so there's a lot of tropes there, and I hate, like, if you don't pay for the product, you're out of product. Like, it's sort of true, but not really. Data is not the new oil. It's not bought and sold like oil. Like, there's a lot of tropes there that I think are a little wrong. We can take apart any one of those. But I think the fact that advertising is a strange business model when you think about it, right? In all of commerce, right? Like, you make or build a thing and then you sell the thing. In advertising, it's different. You use a thing and then a third party pays you, or pays to show you a thing to use that thing, right? And whatever value that publisher extracts and whatever value that advertiser is paying to see you has nothing to do with the value that you extract from that product. It's a very strange triangle trade when you think about it. But, as ad tech people say, it pays for the internet. That's like, believe it or not, like, so many services would not get paid for with advertising, which, by the way, is maybe one of the problems that Web3 solves, but we can get into that. But I think the advertising side is a big part of it. That just changes everything. There's data privacy, there's content moderation, right, which is a big issue. There's all these expectations around, like, filtering content just didn't exist when I was there. I mean, one of the teams that I ran was the ads police, the team that actually policed ads. And, like, it was like the most horrible dog shit job ever. Like, nobody wanted it because it was just unimportant. It was a tiny little team. Nobody cared about it. Now, of course, it's one of the most important functions of Facebook, but it's just, it was just not something that was done at the time. It was not considered a responsibility from Facebook, which many people would object to. Arguably, in my case, we should go back to a 1A standard to everything, but I know that's a minority belief at this point.
So your view is that in terms of the policy backlash, it's fundamentally driven not by the size of these companies, but the kind of implications, economic, cultural, of the kind of ad tech component of it.
I mean, I would disentangle them, because I think people ascribe motivations to these companies. Maybe Google, a little bit, it's big enough a company, but, like, Mark Zuckerberg was never been motivated by money. He never has been, right? And there's a chapter in the book about it. It's like like the greedy person is rational and in some sense is just a predictable character. Someone who's like, fulminating desire in life is to have everyone mediate their social life via Facebook. Like that's a much more dangerous character, right? And that, right, and that is what drives him, in my opinion, and that company. And so, in some sense, that's way more dangerous than like, oh, they're trying to sell ads. Like, ads was such a ghetto product. Like broadly, like you were not cool if you worked in ads. Like I worked there because I was an ads guy and I'm happy to be a mercenary because whatever. But like, it was not the cool place to be. We weren't in the same building with Zuck. Our offices looked like shit basically at the time. Like things have probably changed a little bit now. It's a little bit more central. But it was not a cool place to be. The company, it's funny. No one ever believes Zuck. He wrote in the S1 before the IPO. We don't build services to make money. We make money to build services. And that was always true when I was there, at least. No one really cared about ads. It was seen as this necessary evil. From what I understand at Google, a lot of Google's that way as well. You have the core AdWords product, which makes a shockingly large fraction of Google's revenue. And people look down on it and they work on these crazy little projects, all paid for by ads, but they don't think about it, right? It's like somebody with a trust fund called AdWords that pays for everything. And they don't quite understand where it comes from. And so that, again, that's the reality. But again, I'm not saying companies are less evil than you're thinking. I'm saying potentially they're more evil, they're just different. They're not motivated by revenue per se. I think, yeah.
So is part of it that they're not, part of what you're saying is that someone like a Mark Zuckerberg is in fact thoughtful and purposeful.
Yes.
It's just that he's not motivated by money.
Correct.
But when you're looking at a Google, for example, I mean, do you see that same intentionality behind?
I mean, Google's different, right? I mean, the other thing is that they're no longer led by the founders, right? Zuck is still in charge, which is amazing that you consider that you have a company that large. Let's say $1 trillion company, not $1 trillion company anymore, but they've lost a lot of market cap recently. But so it's a little bit different. I mean, secret. I was interviewing there. It was either Google or Apple when I went from the previous startup, and so I was like, well, did I go to Google or go to Apple? I think it's much more of a set business, right? Working at Google and ads is like working at Chevron and like energy, right? It's like you've got a machine, you turn the crank, you're part of the machine. That's end of story.
So
right?
should that have any bearing on how we think about regulating these entities? So let's zero in on a Google, for example. I mean, Google is certainly accused of being a monopolistic.
Well, it definitely is, yeah.
So then, how should we think about approaching it? So I guess, part of what you're saying is that, look, this is a company that does not have that kind of intentionality. It's not led by a founder. They're trying to, maximize revenue. That seems like a perfectly healthy capitalistic thing to be doing. Well,
but they are monopolistic. So in general, I'm sort of anti-regulation because I think anything. I know I've gotten in trouble in saying this in DC before, but we're not in DC. Anything the government touches will kind of, we used to have a joke. Can I be this film? And I know you're conservative.
Please.
We used to have a joke in physics laboratories called the shit finger. Like literally everything they touch turns to shit. And so it's kind of true, kind of with government regulation as well. But the regulation is always several years behind, and it always just creates another form of regulatory arbitrage. I mean, a key example would be GDPR, right? The privacy regulation that have these damn pop-ups on your web browser all the time. Do you feel better now? Is your data actually better now than it was before? Like how much productivity do you all lose hitting on those little pop-ups? Of course it is, right? It's like a joke. So I'm not super pro-regulation. That said, the monopoly criticism I think is real. I think antitrust, it's not crazy to propose it. I've written pieces about, saying, yeah, maybe Facebook should be broken up, right? Like it's not clear to me why Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp should be under the same roof. Do you get any value from Facebook owning both Instagram and WhatsApp? Not really. They get a huge amount of value, by the way, both, not WhatsApp, because it's not ads, but like they unified their ad sales teams, they unified the ops backend. If you're trying to create an Instagram club, which I would not recommend because I think Instagram's a little passé, but say you were, it would be very difficult for you to do so. In addition to, speaking of regulation, all these expectations around content moderation, right? Or like pulling on content, that just you realize that widens their moat, right? It makes it much, if you and me started a startup with some Instagram clone, like the expectation will be that the pornography or the beheading video or the disinformation, by whatever definition, disappears like on day one, right? And that's very difficult to do at scale, right? Even Facebook, as you know, struggles to do it. There's no way a startup's going to do it. So in some way, imposing these constraints often only deepens or entrenches the very monopolies they're meant to go after. That said, breaking up companies, no, it just breaks it up. That's it. You just don't know what's up anymore.
And when you think about the breakup of these entities, I suppose one thought is that Google transformed themselves into Alphabet so that they could actually break up along, this is the conspiracy theory, along favorable lines. They will create the boundaries around the entities.
Right.
So, kind of is what you're suggesting, let's break them up with an eye towards competition so that there are different brands that, kind of should be contending with one another? Or is there some other way in which you as, super regulator with, kind of, unlimited power, is there another way that you would think about breaking them up?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I don't know how wonky you want to get here, but antitrust law is very dated, and it was created in the time of the railroad tycoons and updated in the 60s and 70s with Bork. And it's still not like a lot of antitrust laws around consumer harm and consumer pricing. You don't pay for any of these products. What does it even mean, right? It's a meaningless statement, right? And so obviously antitrust needs to be rejiggered in various ways. But again, so just to take the contrary take to what I just said, like the other argument, right, is that monopolies never really go away. If you look at like Windows never lost a desktop, Google has never lost search, Facebook's never going to lose that form of social media, right? Like these companies, antitrust never actually knocks them from their pedestal in any serious way, nor does competition for that matter, right? It just creates other fields that are just more important. The internet now is more important than desktop. I mean, desktop didn't go away, but it's just compared in terms of total market value, it's not as important as these other fields, right? So like, for example, Web3, which I assume we'll get into at some point, is kind of that bit. It's not like they're not building a Facebook clone, right? They're just building a space in which Facebook is just not going to dominate, and it's going to be more important. And then Facebook's going to be like Microsoft is with Word. It's like, well, it's there, but like, who cares? It's not the main show in the story.
Okay, so now let's talk about precisely that.
Okay.
There's been a lot of enthusiasm about how blockchain technology might renew the promise of the internet, an idea that's been dubbed Web3.
Right.
First of all, how is Web3 different from Web 1 and Web 2?
Right. So, okay, maybe the best way to explain this, forget the blockchain for a moment because it sounds scary. So does everyone know what Web 1 is, out of curiosity? Kind of. Do people know what that means? So just to remind you, I mean, people here are probably roughly old enough to remember. If not, you can imagine. Web 1 was core technologies like HTTP, like the protocol that literally the browser looks at, or your email, for example, or things you probably don't use anymore or have forgotten about, like FTP or Telnet or whatever. These were defined as protocols. What protocol just means, like, oh, this is the type of message that I send from computer A to computer B when it's doing thing C, right? Whatever it is, loading a web page, sharing information, whatever. These are just agreed on. Like, this is the standard. If you want to build on this is what it is. And you can build a value-added service on top of that and compete for that second layer of value, but nobody owns that protocol. Nobody can kick you off email. You can't be canceled from email, right? I mean, maybe Google can say, oh, your account's closed because of whatever, but then you just open another one and you still send email, right? Nobody owns, in some sense, that version of you. Like I often joke, everything in American society is a bid for nostalgia. Like, everyone's trying to go to the past in some way, even Web3 people. What they're trying to return with a V, what they're returning to is Web 1, a world in which you have an open standard, in which nobody owns it. There's no, Twitter can't just say, sitting American president or former president, like, you're just off of Twitter, even though the Iranian mullahs are still on it, right? No, nobody can say that. We just agree that there's this open standard, and there's this thing called the blockchain that basically, imagine it as a database that's public that nobody owns. So like, if you and I have to agree on something, like, oh, I'm sending you X, whatever, like decrement this, increment that, that database just exists, right? And forget for the moment how it works. It's just magical. It's not quite magical, but there's this token dynamic that actually incentivizes people to do the work of maintaining that network, right? That's the mining that's involved in the network. You're basically doing the day-to-day work of the network, and you effectively get paid for it. You might be wondering, like, why are these coins and tokens always involved? There has to be an economic mechanism to actually maintain that blockchain all the time, because again, nobody owns it. Without the token mechanism, it just doesn't work. Why would you do the work? Right. Blockchain in Ethereum is basically a global computer stored on hundreds of machines, and they're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it because they get paid for it, right?
It's sort of, there's a way in which so many technologies that we use obscure the fact that there is work that's being done, or when you think about free services, they're not in fact free. Yeah.
Right. And the weird thing about crypto, and why it can often feel a little bit mercenary and a little bit scammy, is because the economics kind of come first, right? Like, how you get paid and why is like day one priority. Unlike Facebook, where it was still like literally a month before the IPO, and they hadn't figured out how to make money, right? Which was what I described in the second half of my book, right? Like, it was still like, in a Cheryl meeting, like, everyone raise their hand, like, do you have an idea? Like, our our monetization isn't going up. Like, what do we do? There's an IPO in 3 months, right? Like, no, day one conversation. How do you get paid? How do the economics work? Make sure it actually works out. So that's the idea, right? The thought that we can create a world in which you can get paid, right? And the bank, in some sense, can't shut you down. Of course, that's not true, and we can get into when crypto actually touches the real world, things don't quite work that way. But that's the idea, right?
So you've taken us from Web 1 to Web 3, and the ways in which Web 3 reflects some of the kind of values of Web 1, the kind of promise of Web 1. But we've talked kind of broadly about Web 2, but kind of presented to us in this schema. Kind of what did that represent? So it represented a retreat from Web 1 in the sense of the creation of walled gardens. Is that how you'd characterize it? Tell us a bit.
Yeah. Right. Again, it's a world of protocols rather than platforms, right? In the sense, again, you can't send a Facebook message to someone who's on Twitter, right? Like, there's no cross platform ability. You can't. I mean, now you sort of can take your data from Facebook, but not really. You can't take your data from Facebook and like reinstantiate another network. You're basically locked into the network, right?
So what was the great virtue of Web 2? Why did it become so dominant?
Well, because someone did own it, and someone was actually incentivized to actually drive user growth as much as possible. It's a good question, though. I've yet to read like a really good theory as to why we flipped to Web 2 and why it suddenly took off, other than the fact that like they'd managed their growth better.
Would you argue that Web 3 represents a kind of marriage of the virtues of Web 1 and Web 2? But with
I think it's
Web
more,
2, it creates some kind of ownership so that there's an incentive to kind of maintain the commons. Is that the way to think about it?
yeah. Although one of the criticisms of Bitcoin initially and now crypto is that like crypto like decentralizes everything as an article of faith and then recentralizes things later awkwardly for the sake of like it actually working, which is true. You might have heard of things like NFTs, we might get to in a second. There's a company called OpenSea that, to a very crude approximation, is the eBay of NFTs, where you would go and buy and sell your NFTs. And again, NFTs exist on what's called the Ethereum blockchain. So you own a thing like independent of anybody. Nobody can take that NFT away from you. But if you actually wanted to get real money for it, you would have to sell it on OpenSea. And so there is a central point of failure in that if you pissed off OpenSea for whatever reason, potentially they wouldn't. So again, they wouldn't take it away from you in the sense that Facebook can actually delete your page, but you may not necessarily be able to actually sell it. And that's what there's a tension. There's a big tension between decentralization and centralization, and the sort of utopic vision of Web3 and then the reality of it, right?
From the perspective of a typical user, what are the biggest problems with the internet as it currently exists, and what are some ways that Web3 technologies might overcome those?
Well, I mean, if you're like a Web3 zealot, I mean, you would say all the pitfalls of Web2 are it, right? The fact that right, like there's a saying, well, Chris Dixon says it, who's a VC who runs probably the biggest crypto fund at A16Z, can't be evil is better than don't be evil. Don't be evil was the famous canard from Google that they wouldn't actually follow in a lot of practice. But the idea is being, well, can't be evil means you actually can't get canceled. You can't get dispossessed, right? And so I think the Web3 people would say that a lot of those, what they consider to be authoritarianism in the Web2 world goes away with Web3. The reality, though, is we're to be frank, right? A lot of how Web3 works is actually pretty weird, right? Like, again, why do you use this? And you probably heard it, and it's a little bit overstated, but like a lot of the energy that it takes to run Bitcoin and stuff. But it's like, why do you run it this way? Like, if you just need a database to keep track of like tomatoes you're selling, just have a database table with tomato counts. Like, we don't need this whole public blockchain. I think a lot of the interest in it, just to get back to the issue of like, how do you undo these massive behemoths? I think a lot of people just want to live in a world in which they're tired of talking about Facebook and Google, right? They're trying to imagine a world in which that's not the dominant parent. Like let's just talk about something else. And blockchain is just a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. And again, in case I haven't painted the vision big enough, one thing is crypto and Bitcoin. Like, okay, fine, digital gold that you can email, fine. Something like Ethereum is very different. You have what's called the smart contract, right? And we're going to get into this with DAOs and stuff probably. Like, let's say you and I have an agreement that you and I co-own this property, a treasury, which has a number of tokens in it. And we can't actually wire that money anywhere unless we both sign it with some sort of digital key. Like, that's a contract. If we both sign it, that thing is worth $1 billion. Like, $1 billion goes out the door, right? And that is encoded not in law, but in code, right? It literally will just happen, right? If someone steals your key, they can steal that money, and there's possibly no redress, right? Although, of course, the FBI can catch them. Another misleading thing is that, like, oh, crypto's for money laundering. Not really. The FBI loves Bitcoin, right? Because it's completely public, right? They get people, FBI catches people all the time, because the moment that actually touches like a real bank, that all gets reported, and there's a know your customer. It's like a conventional bank. If you ever actually try to, take that stolen $10 million, unless you're a Russian mobster, and perhaps not even then, it's very difficult to actually turn into real money. But the idea being is that the dynamics of the system work according to code rather than law. I mean, it's really the triumph of, I hate to use the thing, but it's kind of the triumph of like the coding nerd over sort of conventional society.
So you don't sound especially enamored of these technologies.
Oh,
as
no, I am.
things
I'm
that
totally
will be-
positive.
Okay,
Sorry.
so talk to us a bit about the kind of what you see as the transformative potential. So, cryptocurrency, which you've touched on
Right.
briefly, is something that, there's a lot of utopian thinking around it and how it can democratize finance and much else. Tell us a little bit about what you see in it.
Yeah, we talked to some of the biggest zealots. I mean, they think I don't necessarily disagree with them. They're very smart people who have made a lot of good calls in the past, like VCs who are professional investors who've made lots of money over the past 20 years. They really think it's a refactoring of like finance, right? The thought that you would invest in a company and you own these pieces of paper called shares, right? Can just completely change. It's like, no, we can have this thing called a decentralized autonomous organization, a DAO, that actually can hold assets, right, as part of these smart contracts. And we can literally regulate ourselves as a new sort of entity via this DAO. And I don't know, you want to go to the Ethereum name service example?
Please,
I said, yeah.
please.
So speaking of cancellation, here's an example. Here's a version of my story in the new Web3 version. You probably haven't followed it. Some of you I spoke to are actually in crypto, so you probably heard the story. There's this aspect of crypto called ENS, Ethereum Name Service. And it's the best analogy is probably to what's called DNS, domain name service, which you might know from Web 2, which is basically when you enter like google.com, that doesn't mean anything in computer speak, right? That has to go to what's called an IP address. And there's a system that literally just maps google.com to like 173.1.2. whatever, right? And it's just because humans can't remember numbers, you need this lookup table, right? And it's a core part of internet infrastructure. It sounds boring, super important. Like half the outages you see is usually some DNS going down thing that can't find the right addresses. In the crypto world, there's an analogous version of it called Ethereum Name Service. If you go to my Twitter handle, you'll see agm.eth. What does that thing map to? Well, it resolves to my Bitcoin addresses, my Ethereum. That's my identity online. That's everything online. So who owns this thing, right? This thing, by the way, the coin is, I don't know if anyone happens to know the market cap. You can yell it out. Whatever the ENS market cap is, it's probably billions by now. It's like we're talking real money with some of these organizations, and it's run by a foundation, right? And so one of the guys, the main dude, or one of the main dudes, Brantley Milligan, who happens to be a Catholic, believes in the Catholic catechism such as it exists, which flies in the face of much secular liberalism these days. And he basically posted a tweet, which admittedly a little bit of a grating, acerbic way, asserted the tenets of the Catholic faith, which, surprise, surprise, aren't exactly in line with, a lot of liberalism these days. And and again, someone dug up the tweets. There was a whole scandal. Someone assigned themselves the leader of what I would call a cancellation coup. The whole Twitter drama that we've gotten used to, like what I had at Apple. Except it kind of didn't work, right? So here's the weird thing: a lot of these organizations. So the DAO controls over $1 billion in ENS coin, and actually controls this lookup system, which is getting more and more important, right? They fired him from like the actual real world entity that like employed him, but they couldn't fire him as what's called a delegate, i.e. someone who actually votes on the issues of concern to that company, nor to the foundation itself, because they held a vote. In the same case in my case, that like 99% of Apple employees didn't actually want me fired. Well, most people didn't want him fired either. Actually, it turns out the very vocal minority of people on Twitter wanted him fired, didn't actually constitute a majority of token holders. And so end of the day, the vote actually closed yesterday. He survived the vote. He's still a director. He's still on the foundation board. I'm sure it's going to be super awkward in the forum when this guy, who everyone else ganged up to kill, or at least a lot of them ganged up to kill and then didn't manage to kill him. And there he is, right? So that's one example where if you were to ask, the Web3, total bulls, like what's one advantage? It's the fact that you don't have a top-down control. Nobody could dispossess this guy. Brantley.eth is the guy's address. Nobody could dispossess that guy of his position or his coins because of a Twitter mob and a panic, for example. Yeah.
Do you see that as an entirely good thing?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, nothing else. It just forces things to slow down, right? Every coup plotter depends on like the fear and panic of the ambush to drive the conclusion forward. And I think, yeah.
Interesting. So with a DAO that has, a very large number of stakeholders, if you want to quote unquote cancel someone, you just have to do much more patient, deliberate work. Right. It can't be this kind of mass moral panic in which people in the C-suite are just concerned about what in fact turns out to be a tiny number of people on social media. Right. Got it. So
it's democracy of a form, but it's really one coin, one vote. Like not everyone didn't get an equal vote, to be clear. And obviously he won because a lot of the major holders were backing him. So, it's not quite democracy in the quite Norman Rockwell way, but it's definitely more democratic than Apple, sure.
When you read about Web3, and you've talked about it yourself, you keep seeing this concept of decentralization.
Yeah.
But, as we discussed before, a lot of the internet became centralized for a reason.
Yeah.
Social networks get more and more valuable as more people join them. So you end up getting together a large number of people on Facebook, not necessarily because it was the best technology available, but rather because, there was this first mover advantage, whatever, people wanted to be with other people. What parts of our internet experience can actually be decentralized and what can't?
Ownership, for one, right? That's what NFTs are about. So people are wondering, like these monkey things, like the JPEG, like why can't you right click and save? I mean, in a world in which we're kind of post-scarcity, in which there isn't digital scarcity, in which you can right click and save, conversely, actually ownership becomes even more important, right? The fact that you can own a thing is actually super important. Like if we're really living in this Gnostic heresy, right, in which we're transporting ourselves into this spiritual, disembodied virtual realm, to use a religious metaphor, of digital ownership, then yeah, you have to own digital things. And in case that sounds strange, like it's not really that strange, right? Think about what is an NFT? It's an abstract notion of ownership over a piece of art that in some sense is a piece of narcissistic consumption that will be identified with myself, that I'll display somewhere. Probably a little bit of money laundering and financial hijinks going on. What am I describing? The conventional art world is what I'm describing, right? NFTs are no different than conventional art world. It's just disintermediating the traditional gallery owners, and a lot of the traditional artists haven't necessarily gone into it, but it's effectively a digital version of the existing art world. Although the art may or may not appeal to you, and fair enough. But yeah, that's one thing that I think Web3 does better than Web2 would, right?
So clearly there are some resonances when you talk about the rise of these kind of uncancelable people, when you talk about these entities where kind of code subs in for law, and, kind of a law where, a lot of people feel as though, gosh, these things are manipulable. When you talk about, kind of the ways in which our elite institutions are dominated by people who increasingly come from a, kind of conformist, narrow culture, it does seem like there's a lot of libertarian enthusiasm about Web3 and a lot of enthusiasm among people on the right. Do you think that that enthusiasm is well placed? Do you think that it's missing something important? Tell us about that.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, look, every institution in American life has been captured by a certain progressive woke elite ideology, right? There's no other way to put it, right? Literally, that's the reality of it. And I think that's not true in Web3 yet. And so, yeah, one thing that I find strange is that the right has kind of turned against tech. Shouldn't name political. Well, people like Josh Hawley, like a lot of people are clamoring for a lot of control of tech, and it's weird because I think conservatives have basically lost every elite institution in the United States, except this one, of course, Reihan. But every other institution has been basically lost, and tech is like their one tool they have. It's like the AK-47 back in the Wars of Liberation days in the 60s and 70s, the one thing they have. Like Ben Shapiro, whatever you think of him, right? And get on Facebook and just blow the doors off every other network with his engagement, which he does, by the way. Ben Shapiro, I don't know if you know, his Facebook numbers are like bigger than MSNBC, any other network you could name. I mean, well, look at Joe Rogan.
And it's something that's very disturbing to some people, to gatekeepers within technology.
Right. Well, sure. Or I was going to say, or Joe Rogan has more downloads per podcast, like many times more than any of the conventional shows that we're all trying to cancel. And speaking of cancel mobs, more than a couple weeks ago.
In fact, this is one reason why people talk about tech as such a baleful force, the fact that they are creating platforms for people with such supposedly dangerous or noxious ideas.
Yeah. I'm trying not to laugh, but okay. Yeah.
So when you look at Web3, what you're seeing is a playing field that is just much more open. It's not necessarily biased towards voices on the right, but rather it is open and it's not captured in the way these other institutions are.
I mean, if I'm putting my Balaji hat on, Balaji Srinivasan is a well-known voice in crypto, and he's super maximalist, and he's a friend of mine. Like, I like the guy, but he definitely comes at it from a certain point of view. It is true meritocracy, right? Like, it's totally open. Like, you can go and look at the development docs for Ethereum or a lot of technologies built on top of it, and you can start developing on it, and it's all publicly visible. It's all open GitHub repos, like these code repositories that you can just read. Everything is open by default, and you're only really limited by your ability to work on stuff and willingness to work on stuff. And that's completely different. Like, nobody can read Facebook source code. You have no idea what's going on under the hood. You can't engage with it. I mean, they have some open APIs and platforms here and there, but by and large, they're very suspicious of outside third parties, and they'll always end up screwing you, which they do. And so Web3 changes that dynamic completely, in that it's very much more open, right? Like, you and I tomorrow could formulate a DAO or build some, L2 like some sort of application built on top of Ethereum name service, some crazy new idea we have. We don't ask anybody for permission. We just go and do it. That's the end of it. Yeah.
So is there a way in which Web2, and these kind of great incumbent Web2 institutions have become a kind of bulwark of this, kind of larger, elite kind of progressive liberal sensibility that you're describing, and Web3 becomes this other force in the world that is a kind of counterweight to it? Is that how you see this shaking out?
Not so much. I mean, getting back to the ENS example, Brandt, the guy who got canceled, he didn't win by that much, right? Like, it was pretty close. Like, there's obviously a fair amount of wokeness inside in crypto. I do think there are opposed for other reasons, though, right? Like, literally a lot of engineers and fan companies that have very nice lives, very nice careers, are literally like, oh yeah, Web3 is cool, I'm going to leave and then go literally build the thing that's going to kill the company that I just worked at, right? Like, getting back to like, what is true tech? Like, is it really Facebook? I would say that is the spirit of true tech, like disruption for the sake of disruption, just because it's shiny and cool and weird and interesting and whatever, it's going to make a dent in the universe. Like, that really still is a guiding ethos for a lot of people on tech. Like, that spirit has not gone away. And so I think that's going to be a lot of what I think unseats these FANG companies, is the fact that a lot of their best talent's going to go just because it's so cool and shiny. And there's just so much, like, again, it's hard to convey it, but there's just so much money and talent going one direction that even if it only ends up being a quarter of the promise, it's still going to be enormous, in my opinion.
So Web 2 survives in a Web 3 world, but it's diminished.
Yeah, probably.
And so there's a sense in which, kind of perhaps what you're suggesting is that the kind of policy debate we're having about containing the power of Web 2 institutions is perhaps a bit dated, or kind of missing the fact that there are these other forces that are going to kind of limit its reach.
I mean, not to ding DC, because I work for kind of a DC policy work. So, I love DC. I love the federal government. But like a lot of debates or like conversations that we have there now, it's like what was being debated and what already seemed to me like a slightly stale debate in 2016, right? Like my book came out and I became like a very loud voice in the whole Facebook debate and content moderation, the election, Trump, the Russians, Cambridge Analytica, all that stuff. And, for all my pains, I ended up getting sucked into the Cambridge Analytica lawsuit. That's a whole separate thing. I actually got deposed in that. But like, it just feels very dated to me and stale. Like, look, there's no fixing Facebook. You're never going to content moderate to the point that you feel satisfied. Facebook is not going to become the oracle of truth in the world, right? If you think those are problems, they're not. I hate to break it to you, they're not going to get solved, right? Facebook doesn't have the scale to actually like manually review all that stuff, and AI is not good enough to actually do it at scale, right? Facebook is just and companies like it are just too enormous, right?
So the centralized nature of these companies makes them vulnerable to capture. The decentralized nature of Web3 entities makes them less vulnerable to capture, but also there's a sense in which they can't be swayed, they can't be controlled. One of the reasons why I think some people celebrate the platforms is that they can be influenced, right? I mean, Sheryl Sandberg is a person in the world. She may or may not have political ambitions. She wants to be held in high esteem by other people, who are in a similar stratosphere, and that is a kind of point of attack that one could use, right, to kind of influence.
I mean, that's the dream. We'll see what the reality ends up being, because again, like I said, I think Web3 tends to decentralize as an article of faith, but then re-centralizes later to actually build like a real product.
Tell me about the fact that Facebook has tried to create its own cryptocurrency. They tried to create Libra, then I think it was later called Diem, but that seems to have gone nowhere. So what does that mean?
The feds, it didn't get a lot of traction, basically died. Twitter's tried to create a crypto version of itself, and it's not really going anywhere. It's a vanity project. I think the way of thinking about Web3 is just fundamentally different. Web2 is just not going to make the leap. I mean, the other question though is that Web3 still presents other problems, to be clear, right? Like privacy. Data can't be deleted from the blockchain, like ever at all, even in theory. There's no way to delete data from the blockchain, right? How do you have a right to be forgotten in the blockchain world? Well, you don't, right? Mind you, not all data in Web3 lives in the blockchain, to be clear, so it's not as an unsolvable problem as I'm portraying it exactly. But there's a lot of privacy issues. Like, how do you feel about having every transaction you make publicly visible and browsable? There's like a browser for Bitcoin, so you can see every transaction for an address, right? Do you like that feeling? Does it make you feel warm inside? No, right? There's problems with it, right? And there's Web3 solutions to it, to be clear. I'm not saying it's unsolvable, but I think we've tended to regulate and control and talk about these companies in a certain way, and Web3 is so different. I predict each of these sort of talks, there has to be a prediction that you could, that's verifiably right or wrong. There's going to be a massive collision between a lot of regulation and Web3 as soon as we get there. But I think it's several years away. We're still thinking we can solve Facebook, which is, to me, a quaint concern. But
so I want to turn to questions from the audience, but before I do, one last question for you from me. The rise of Web 2 has coincided with the rise of a lot of technology anxiety about addiction to technology, anxiety about the effect that it has on our kind of inner emotional states. You've written a bit about the idea of a larger transition from a kind of text-oriented culture to an oral culture. There is just a sense that there's been a real deep, durable social cultural upheaval, and we don't kind of fully understand its implications. Does Web3 represent, some alternative, some pumping of the brakes, or no? Are we still going full throttle into this?
I think it's like a longer step along the same trajectory, actually, in many ways. The thing about Web2 and the text and oral thing, just briefly, because I know we want to do questions. You've probably read McLuhan and some of these theorists from back in the day, right? Like the medium is the message and all these sort of vernacular pronouncements from McLuhan. But the reality is that how we consume information and how we perceive the world changes the way we think about the world, right? And an oral culture, right? Like what we're doing here, I'm facing you people, we're speaking, or this dialectic, right? Not that we're debating, but it could be an antagonistic thing. You say a thing, contradict you, etc. That's very different than sitting there and reading 8,000 words in the New Yorker, right? That turns you in on yourself, right? In an oral culture, there's no way to look something up, right? Everything exists either through direct experience or through the second-hand experience of somebody you know, right? Text and oral cultures, a lot of books have been written about it, it's just very different. And I think the internet is taking us back to an oral world, right? Even Twitter, which is in theory text, has oral modes of thought. Like you post a thing, I dunk on you by retweeting, you retweet, we get into a fight, all our various followers get into it. You know, the truthiness of your statement is a function of who you are as a person. There's no real truth. I mean, there's aspects of textual culture, there's search, it's index and stuff, but mostly it's an oral medium. Not to even mention things like TikTok or Instagram, totally oral culture, right?
And one could use it, one could engage with it in different ways in a more kind of text-oriented way, but what's addictive and what is,
is the
kind of consuming is the oral dimension.
Yeah. Right. And so, yeah, I don't know that Web3 necessarily solves that. I think if anything, that's a further break between, I think, the physical and the sort of spiritual and virtual worlds that we live in. I tend to live in that world, so I don't mind it so much, but it does seem deeply unnatural.
In which world?
In that virtual world, in that Gnostic world of the spiritual world instead of the physical realm that we live in. I think we talked about this before the thing, right? If you ask me, like, what's the biggest thing that's happened in the past 200 years that nobody talks about, or like talks about not very much, is the decoupling of like the way matter moves from information moving. Like everyone here is probably old enough to remember like letters. Remember letters? Like literally information went as fast as physical objects move. That's no longer true at all. Of course, it's been a long transformation. It's been 200 years, but still we've gotten to the point where they're completely decoupled, right? And I think that's very strange. When you're virtual, intellectual, moral, you know, every aspect of your being is completely uncoupled from your physical surroundings. That changes everything, right? Like people in this room probably have much more in common with people in other polities and other parts of the world that has nothing to do with like literally the colored square on the map called New York in the United States of America. And if you see things like our completely polarized nation state, it's because concepts like the nation state, the fact that we all share the same narratives and the same culture and the same views and the same aims and hopes within those bounds, like that is going away. And I don't think it's coming back. And so I don't know what principled organization lasts after that. If you really think about the big crypto futurists, once again, like Balaji, he's imagining like city states with a DAO around it, like a whole crypto world in which you've decoupled from the physical and exist in, I mean, you still live as a physical entity, to be clear, but you're no longer bound by the state of California, the state of Nevada, or state of whatever. You're living in your own charter city with your own rule book, with your own whatever. I don't know if I quite buy it, but it's one solution to the problem that we're seeing today, in which we no longer have a common story at all.